Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, reporting Tibet, the Chinese authorities attacking the media. Hamas, Fatah, and the media battle being fought over Palestine. The Mugabe government talking tough over the foreign news coverage of the Zimbabwean election.
The BBC banned from Zimbabwe, so Ola Gearin reports from Johannesburg.
And Hillary comes under fire over Bosnia and fires back.
Unfortunately for Mrs. Clinton, some of the hardest fighting the human race has ever seen was currently raging.
Welcome back. Tibet has been a tale of two stories. The international media's version of the rioting, a story of freedom-fighting monks rising up against Chinese oppression. According to China's media, though, it was a case of ethnic brutality, unprovoked, with Tibet's Chinese population as the victims. Our starting point this week, the conflicting casualty figures, the jamming of radio signals, and the blocking out of TV transmissions in the media war over Tibet.
It's very hard to know where the truth is and what the real situation in Lhasa and in the whole of Tibet actually is.
There are definitely attempts from the Chinese side to block our transmissions.
This is the biggest and most important story in China for 20 years. We haven't seen unrest like this since Tiananmen Square.
Much has changed since Tiananmen Square and the 1989 pro-democracy protests that ended with hundreds massacred. In many ways, today's China is a more open place to report from. However, some things have not changed, such as the government's denial reflex.
On the Friday, when Tibetans started rioting in Lhasa, there was no information from the Chinese government at all. And one of the main problems is that the Chinese government does not provide any information in the time frame with which the Western media needs to report. We report as far as possible in real time now. With satellite communications and so on, we need to say what's happening pretty much as it's happening, and the Chinese government comes up much later.
When the rioting broke out, there was only one Western journalist in Lhasa, James Miles, a reporter for the UK weekly The Economist.
They actually praised him on Chinese state television for being objective, because he did report that there was violence against Han Chinese. So one would have thought that they would want to open up. However, they seem to have reverted to a default position, which is that when something goes wrong, keep the press out as much as possible, and when you let them in, do so under extremely strictly confined circumstances.
And when the Chinese government finally got its version of the story out,
police and security forces showed restraint and saved lives.
It took issue with the dominant narrative coming from Western reporters, Tibetan underdogs seeking independence from their Chinese occupiers. And Beijing pulled no punches when it took on the Western news media.
CNN chopped this photograph, cutting out mobs throwing stones at armed police trucks, making the scene appear to be military trucks driving towards civilians.
For the Chinese media, this is a story of unprovoked, savage rioting and brutality against Han Chinese by ethnic Tibetans in Lhasa. And the Chinese authorities are clearly extremely angry at what they see as biased reporting by the West, ignoring the provocation that they feel has been met with, on their side, considerable restraint.
I don't like being described as a member of the Western Goebbels Nazi media, which is how we are being described on a website called anti-CNN.com, and that was repeated seemingly approvingly in the China Daily. But I think it's a sign of how anxious the Chinese government is about its image, that it's trying to blame the Western media and going back to Cultural Revolution language.
China also blacked out newscasts coming from outside the country and jammed radio signals of stations such as Radio Free Asia, a news service funded by the US government.
Chinese are trying to control and crack down. They are trying to control by, taking away the cell phones, and they're trying to find out and identify those persons who try to pass information to other organizations like us. They are trying their best to control the information, and particularly outflow of information to us.
Then China made an attempt to repair some of the damage the Tibet story had caused. The government took 40 hand-picked reporters to the Tibetan capital, but the plan backfired.
That was supposed to be a propaganda trip. It was supposed to show that everything was calm in Lhasa and that monks and ordinary Tibetans blame the Dalai Lama for what happened. It was supposed to prove the government's line. And it went spectacularly wrong because a group of monks burst into the briefing which the journalists were having in the Jokang temple and started shouting that they were not free and shouting in support of the Dalai Lama. They said the prayers in the temple had been staged by the Communist Party for the journalists. So in the end it didn't matter which journalists went because we saw the pictures and we saw what happened. Chinese people didn't see those pictures because CCTV, Chinese state television, and it didn't show anything of the protest.
They were confident that by exposing these monks to the Western media, who were obviously on a guided tour, they will get their story out. The reality is, in their heart of heart, Tibetan people, no matter how much money you give them, you cannot snatch away their devotion to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And that is why, knowingly, by speaking out their mind, they are risking their life.
The fighting on the streets of Tibet turned into a propaganda battle across multiple media platforms. China has allowed an unprecedented number of journalists into the country and loosened some of the rules they work under. That's because the Beijing Olympics are coming. But in media terms, the games have already begun.
It's very interesting that the Chinese state media has actually reported it at all. In the past, stories like this would get no coverage at all.
This is the Chinese government's version of last Friday's riots in Lhasa. A special program broadcast on state TV on Thursday night.
I think in the modern era of the internet, mobile phone photographs, the Chinese government recognizes that it can't suppress information anymore, so they've been trying to control it.
This country is getting very rich. This country is very powerful. This country is in many ways very successful. If they can be slightly less sensitive, if they can open up just a little bit, that would be, I think, a really good thing for China and for the rest of the world. And I think Tibet is a test of that.
Our Global Village Voices now with their take on the coverage of Tibet.
Chinese also launched their own tactics. Tibetans showing breaking Chinese shops and attacking Chinese, but that is not the full picture. What Chinese government want to show, that they show it to the world media, and all you see is only the Chinese version of it. What you didn't see is thousands and thousands of armies pouring into the street of Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, as well as the remote Tibetan areas.
Western media and the China media, when they say China is propaganda, but who is not propaganda? American very much so as well. It's like who is clean enough to criticizing another country? Americans themselves are in Iraq, Afghanistan.
The Chinese, they started to bring their own few selective media person inside Tibet. They wanted to show the international community that they are doing something good for the media, but it doesn't happen. Like all these medias being arranged by the Chinese government.
We're always open to direct on-air feedback from our viewers on the state of the news media around the world. Just email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net and we'll find a way to get you on the air as one of our Global Village Voices. There's a recurring theme in our News Bites section this week, the state of the news media in the former Soviet bloc, but we'll start with the Zimbabwe story. The Mugabe government has warned that it will deal severely with foreign news media who have sneaked into the country and are reporting on the election illegally.
The BBC banned from Zimbabwe, so Ola Gearin reports from Johannesburg.
Much of the international media have already been banned from Zimbabwean soil and have set up camp and set up live shots on the South African side of the border. Zimbabwe's information minister said that the BBC and CNN have established facilities at secret locations within Zimbabwe. He accused them of broadcasting imperialist propaganda. As for what Zimbabweans are seeing on their television screens, Britain's Independent newspaper reported that in the immediate aftermath of the vote, Zimbabwean TV was ignoring election coverage in favor of a bizarre mix of cartoons, church sermons, and football matches from the 1970s. But that's state-run television for you. Resistance to a new media law has led Slovakia's 6 leading daily newspapers to publish simultaneous protests in the form of blank front pages. The proposed law gives the government's culture ministry direct control on a range of subjects and requires newspapers to print the government's response to any and all news reports, regardless of its veracity. The government of Prime Minister Robert Fico has been under pressure from media organizations and from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to change the new law. The media watch group Reporters Without Borders, known by its French acronym RSF, is keeping up the pressure on the Kremlin to bring the killers of journalist Anna Politkovskaya to justice. It's been almost a year and a half since Politkovskaya, a reporter for the Novaya Gazeta newspaper, was found murdered in her Moscow apartment building. The authorities say they know who killed her, now they just need to find him. So far, 9 suspects have been detained, including a former policeman, Pavel Ryaguzov, who was accused of providing the killer or killers with Politkovskaya's address. RSF accuses the authorities of failing to show the determination required to find and punish those responsible. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko is known as Europe's last dictator, and now at least 16 and perhaps as many as 30 Belarusian journalists have had their homes and offices raided in a police crackdown that came on the heels of a major opposition rally in the capital, Minsk. The reasons given for the arrests vary. The authorities have said the reporters were detained for not having proper accreditation, while the journalists say they were questioned about the coverage of the protest. However, it's also been suggested that President Lukashenko is still smarting from this satirical cartoon, which came out on the web in 2006, and that Lukashenko is hunting for any journalist with ties to the cartoon's creators. Back after the break with the media conflict that's distorting the news from Palestine.